So in this video I'm going to compare the Digitone and Analog 4, and they're very different, and it's a bit of an odd comparison, but I've gotten a few requests, so I wrote down some thoughts, and this comparison is from my perspective. I use this synth mostly as standalone groove boxes, and I sometimes pair them with the Digitact, but I really like working within the limitations of the boxes themselves. So there's a bunch of features that I don't use, and I'll just list them right now. I don't use the song mode, I don't use the MIDI tracks to sequence other gear, I don't use Overbridge to multitrack, I don't use Analog 4 as an audio interface. I'll talk more about that later. I don't use the Digitone's Control All, and I rarely use the CV gates or the MIDI loopback. I wrote down a few thoughts. So the first one is price. I paid 6,000 Norwegian crowns for my Digitone and 10,000 for the Analog 4, and that's roughly $600 and $1,000. The resale value on this is a lot worse than on the Digitact, because I think new the Analog 4 costs about 15,000 Norwegian crowns, and the Digitone costs maybe 7,000 or 8,000 crowns new. But on the used market they usually go for 6,000, the Digitone, and around 10,000 for the Analog 4. And the next point is they both have the amazing Elektron Sequencer, where you can, on both of them, you can go in and you can place notes and then change the value of everything per step, which is really nice. You can do that on both of them. The sequencers are both amazing. The Digitone has 8 voices and the Analog 4 has 4 voices. That makes the Digitone a lot easier to make full tracks on, because you can have one voice for bass, one for lead, 3 or 4 notes for chords, and then 2 notes for drums, or 2 voices for drums. And you don't have to worry about voices as much as on the Analog 4, where you have one voice for the drums, one voice for the lead, one voice for bass, and just one voice for chords, which you can do because you have two oscillators. But you have to be a lot more creative with how you use the voices on the Analog 4, which leads into the next point, which is the number of controls. The Analog 4 just has a lot more of everything in terms of control. You have 2 oscillators each, and you have a noise generator. You have some extra options for how the oscillators behave together. You have 2 filters. You have 2 envelopes, or 3 envelopes. You have an amp envelope and 2 envelopes that you can assign 2 destinations each. You have 2 LFOs, both of them with 2 destinations each. You have 10 knobs instead of 8 on the Digitone. And what the Digitone has is a synth 1 and 2 page, and they both have a subpage. And you have one filter, and it has the filter envelope is built into this page. But you also have a bass width filter for cutting off low end and high end. You have an amp envelope and 2 LFOs, but they only have 1 destination each. And there's a separate page for the effect sends. And so you have less stuff to control on the Digitone, and you have a lot of stuff to control on the Analog 4. Both have their advantages and disadvantages. Yeah, and a couple of things too is on the Analog 4 you have what you usually have to use an LFO for on the Digitone, like pitch bend or a vibrato. They have a built-in parameter on the Analog 4, so you don't need to use an LFO or an envelope. On Oscillator 2's second page you have a vibrato depth and vibrato speed. So you don't have to use an LFO for that. And you also have a couple of other things, like if you're gonna make drums, there's a built-in bend, pitch bend, or bend depth, which plays with the note slide time. So you don't have to use an envelope for pitch bend, or you don't have to use an LFO for vibrato. While on the Digitone you have to. So the number of and you have less destinations on the LFOs and no destinations on the envelopes. The Analog 4 has performance macros, while the Digitone has control all. So control all, I can explain that first. You have let's say you have this sound, or let's play this melody. You can, by holding the MIDI button, control this parameter on all voices. On the Analog 4 you have performance macros, which are, there's a separate page where you have 10 knobs where you can assign up to 5 parameters each, and you can make some really nice convenient shortcuts using these macros. For example, this sound. On this sound, I had assigned a couple of parameters. I assigned the filter frequency. I also assigned the oscillator 2's level. So by default, you're not hearing the second oscillator, but as I'm turning up the performance macro, we're hearing both the oscillators. And you can also do things like increase the overdrive, but also reduce the amp envelope or amp volume. So yeah, you have 10 of these, which you can assign as you'd like. And you also have a quick performance macro knob, where you can hold this button and then select which of the performance macros you want to control with this one. And the nice thing about that is, if I want to control this one and this one, I can access different pages while controlling the performance macro. You don't have to be on the performance page. So I can do things like this. So I basically mixed in the second oscillator separately from the performance macro, and you can do that with the filter. You can change, you can basically jump around and make changes while also having that smooth changing performance macro. Yeah, I can talk about one disadvantage about the control all, and that is when we're just playing melodies. It works fine, I think. We can do things like that works fine, but if you have something like drums, where all the sounds are, they're all even individually p-locked, it doesn't sound as good. So let's try something like this. it's a bit more unpredictable, and since the sound blocks will always reset every time they play, all the changes you make, like if I have p-locked the filter, it'll always snap back to the original value, and then since I'm moving up here with the control all on the filter, it'll jump up to this one, and it'll do it on every trig you're playing. So it could be a cool effect. I use it sometimes as an effect, but it makes it very limited and hard to work with. So. And yeah, so with the performance macros, it takes a lot longer to make changes, or it takes a lot longer to set it up, but you have way more control over how the performance macros work. The difference between the control all and the performance macros is also that when you're turning the macros, they'll be adding or subtracting this much. So instead of snapping to an absolute value, you're adding or removing this much from this parameter. There's no jumping values. The effects, both of them have a chorus, delay, and reverb. And I think the Digitone's chorus, delay, and reverb sound better out of the box. So for example, the delay I just think it sounds better with the default values, or even if you change things around. Like on the delay, I've filtered out the lows and highs. I've set the feedback to very high and slight ping pong. And what that does is the delay will sort of cut away all the highs and lows, and then it'll stay in the middle, as opposed to the default value, which is like this. We're hearing all the repeating notes, but with this filter, it's a bit more smoother. And the analog for delay and reverb and chorus, they don't sound as good out of the box as the Digitone, but you have a lot more control over how they sound, because you have two LFOs that you can, and they both have two destinations, and you can assign them to the different parameters, which is something you can't do on the Digitone. So the delay on this synth sounds... I've made it sound a bit more organic by using an LFO. Let's see, using an LFO and set it to the delay time. And I'm changing the delay time a little bit, and I'm also making the delay a lot wider by assigning the same LFO to delay width, so it'll move the delay around. I'm using the second LFO with a square wave to sometimes just change the delay time a little bit, so you'll get this really cool sort of jittering effect. Yeah, there it was. So yeah, the Digitone, I think it sounds better if you just use it as a normal delay or a normal reverb, but you can do some really nice stuff with the LFOs. You have a sequencer for effects settings, so I could go in and change. Let's change delay time, and then it'll sound like this. enable this and then it'll play. Yeah, so you can do some crazy stuff with the FX. The Digitone has a master overdrive. Which also affects incoming sounds, so let's play this version. Now we're hearing the analog 4. Yeah, so this one, the Digitone, has a master overdrive. It's right at the end of the signal chain, while the analog 4 doesn't have any of that. The inputs can be run through the chorus, delay and reverb, same as this one. You can apply, they both have a left and right input, and you can increase the volume of the left and right inputs, and then you can pan them on both of them, and they can both apply different amounts of chorus, delay and reverb. The next thing is that the analog 4 has 4 different trig types. So when we're inside a sequence, let's listen to this one. You can press and hold a few trigs and then press the trig mute, which will mute these trigs in the sequence without removing them. Yeah, so there are four trig types. There's trig mute, which will mute whichever trig is highlighted. There's accent. Actually, let's just listen to them. So yeah, so accent will accentuate some of the trigs. Mute trig will just mute them. Note slide will make this note slide to the next. Note slides only work in solo mode. Right now I have polyphonic mode, but if I remove it, yeah, so they only work in when they're solo. And the final trig type is parameter slide. The trig you turn into a parameter slide will start to fade into these parameter locks. So let's say this trig sounds like this, and this trig sounds like that, and then we can increase stuff like filter, frequency, overdrive, and level. Then it'll fade from this P-lock to this P-lock. And this is really handy if you have... it's really handy for drums, which I'm not using here, but it's a very nice way. Yeah, actually I am using it. Yeah, I'm using it on the snare to fade into extra delay and a bit of chorus. So if I turn off parameter slide, not much difference, but I've used parameter slides a lot on other tracks, so not a good example right now, but yeah. So therefore these 4 trig types. And they don't always work as expected. Like, for example, if we have a parameter slide on this trig, and then we set the next trig to play every other loop, this trig will still slide to the next trig on every loop, even if we've set this one to play on every other loop. So there are a couple of bugs with the parameter slide, which makes them a bit more difficult to use. Sometimes I just don't bother using them. And my workaround on the Digitone for parameter slides is to just place some lock trigs and then parameter lock all of them, release one note and parameter lock the next, release that note, parameter lock, and then what you'll get is... Actually, let's do it on the filter. Which isn't... it's not smooth because it's not fading, it's not sliding across, but if you're subtle enough, we don't really hear these changes. On the Digitect, you can change patterns right at the end. So let's... so that means if we play a pattern, and then cue another pattern, now it's changed pattern, but it only changes at the end. While on the Analog 4 you can do the same, you can cue patterns. Let's see. And then if we cue a different pattern, it'll jump to that pattern at the end. But I think, yeah, it's 128 steps long, so it'll change now. But what you can do is you can set how the patterns change. So you have direct start, which it'll just immediately play the beginning of the pattern you select. And then you have direct jump, which will, while it's playing a sequence, if we change the pattern on step 13, it'll continue from step 13 on the next pattern. So but direct jump is a bit buggy as well, because if you have let's look at the different sequencer lanes. We have on one of them we have 1/4 scale, and we have half scale, and then we have half scale on this one, and just normal 1 scale on the last, on track 4. And since they're all different, they will jump in at different times when you jump between pages. So I don't use it a lot because all the tracks have to be the same length and they have to have the same scale for it to work. Then there's the voice management. The voice management on the Digitone is a lot more flexible. So, for example, on this pattern, you can do things like go to track 4, which is playing the drums. You can lock 2 of the 8 voices to this track. So this will prevent these 2 voices from being used by any of the other tracks. And then let's listen to this one. You can lock it to have, for example, 1 voice. But since it's a keyboard style sound, then I want as many voices as possible. But I don't want the bass to be voice stolen from any other, so I can lock 1 voice to this one. And then we have the rest of the voices are in the common voice pool, which is used by these two tracks in this case. So it's very flexible. You can also set unison per track. So for example, the bass, it needs two voices to have unison, but we can lock two voices to it. While on the Analog 4, it's a lot more simple. You have these four voices. This means one voice per track. But if we toggle them, you can toggle them down here as well. This means that they are in the sound pool. So now we have two voices in the sound pool, and we can select if it's unison. So this is the bass with unison. And you can have rotate or reset, which means basically polyphonic. But this means we can't make track 1 and 2 polyphonic and then make track 3 and 4 unison, for example. The next thing is that the Digitone has an int to main option and the Analog 4 doesn't. And that means that there's an option here in audio routing called int to main, which can be turned off, auto, or on. And what this does is that when I'm setting it to off and I haven't connected anything other than my headphones, I won't hear anything when I hit play, because all the audio is ignoring the headphones and main outputs, but it's sending audio over USB. So I can send audio to my DAW, FL Studio, and then I can process it there. And since I'm using the Digitone as the audio interface, I can still hear anything that's coming back from FL Studio through my headphones. If we set int to main to auto or on, then I'll get this flanger effect, because I'll be hearing what's coming in from FL Studio, and I'll be hearing what's coming from inside the Digitone itself, out the headphones, at the same time. And the Analog 4 doesn't have this option. Under audio routing, you can select which of the four voices to send to main, and which of the four voices you'll send to the effects, but there's no option to only send audio over USB. So FL Studio will hear the audio coming from the Analog 4 over USB, and then it'll process the audio in FL Studio, then send it back through USB, and then I will hear it on the headphones, and FL Studio will hear what I'm hearing on the headphones, and then get it back over USB to process it again. So there's no way for me to comfortably use the Analog 4 as an audio interface. But this one works, and same with the Digitact and the Analog Heat. But yeah, I'm missing this from the Analog 4. The Analog 4 has two different overdrive circuits, and they have very different flavors. So let's listen to this sound. We have the on the left side we have the old Mark I sound, and on the right side we have the new Mark II sound. And the Mark I sound is a bit weird, so let's check it out. It kind of softens the sound in a way, and the more normal sounding Mark II overdrive is a bit more typical versus the Mark I sound. But the main difference I've noticed is that the Mark II overdrive makes everything louder, and the resonance is very, very noticeable. While on the Mark I overdrive, it sounds a bit weird. Actually, let's turn down the effects and make it monophonic. And here's the Mark II sound. But yeah, I kinda had a hard time getting used to the Mark I sound, but I actually prefer the Mark I sound because it has a weird sort of relationship with the resonance. And this sort of playing around with the filter resonance like this doesn't sound as interesting on the Mark II sound. Here's the Mark I sound. And here's the Mark II sound. So yeah, the Mark I sound, it sort of softens the sound in a way that the Mark II doesn't. So Mark II gets a lot louder, but Mark I is, yeah, it's unique, but a bit hard to use, but I really like it. And the Digitone's overdrive is a lot more basic. It's very subtle. Yeah, it doesn't sound as much as like an overdrive. It's more like a kind of adding a bit of flavor to the sound instead of adding an in-your-face overdrive, which is different from the master overdrive. Which does sound very in-your-face compared to the per track overdrive. So yeah, the Analog 4 has a more intense sounding overdrive and two very useful flavors, while the Digitone has one overdrive, or one type of overdrive per voice, and the master overdrive, but the per voice overdrive is a lot softer. The Analog 4 has a tiny 1-octave keyboard, and it's really handy, I think, for when you are in grid edit mode and then you want to just input notes. So yeah, just press and hold the trig you want to assign a note to, and then play the note, and then it's assigned. And the way you do it on the Digitone is when you are in grid edit mode, you press and hold the trig, and then press the add notes button, and then that takes you to this submenu where you can add as many notes as you want, and you can see which notes are added, and press the trigs again to remove them. And then you press yes to save this, or no to cancel. So we have this trig. Let's make it a bit longer. But you can also, yeah, it works on the analog 4 as well, but you can press and hold several of them and then press the add note button to add notes to all 3 trigs. Let's see. Yeah, and I can see, let's see if it works on this one as well. Yeah, it works. You can hold several trigs to change the note. So I think the Analog 4 is really nice when you have the mini keyboard, but the Digitone is actually a lot more comfortable to add chords, because you can press one trig and then go to the Add Notes menu, and you have all the time in the world to just add notes or remove the note if it was the wrong one. And you can see the notes, and then you can press yes to save it. While on the Analog 4, you have to press and hold the same notes, or press and hold all the notes at the same time. So if we turn on polyphonic mode, this one has a 3-note chord. It's really difficult to add notes across octaves, because you have to hold that trig while pressing the next note, because as soon as you lift the finger, you have saved that note. So yeah, it's easier on the Digitone. The next thing is that the Digitone has patterns, and that's it. You can change pattern, and when you change pattern, you change the sound and tempo and everything. While on the Analog 4, you have kits and patterns. So kits are basically the synth settings and effect settings, and you can use the same kit on several patterns instead of having each pattern being completely standalone like on the Digitone. You can string together several patterns that all use the same kit, and when it switches patterns, all the settings on all the synth tracks, they will carry over to the next pattern without any sharp jumps like on the Digitone. I actually prefer the way it's done on the Digitone and Digitech, because for me anyway, it's a lot more fast-paced to just copy a pattern and then move to a new pattern and paste it and save it, and now I have a complete copy of the previous pattern. While on the Analog 4, I have to copy the pattern and then select a free pattern, paste the pattern, but I also have to remember to save the kit, or actually save this kit to a new kit. Otherwise, all the changes I make on the new pattern will also affect the old pattern. Which is actually something I ruined right now, because if I reload this pattern, I accidentally saved the kit by pressing yes and kit before I saved it to a new unused kit or unused slot. So yeah, you run into those kinds of problems with the Analog 4. And you don't run into those problems on the Digitone, but you do get a different set of problems, and that is switching between patterns will make all the parameters jump to their new values instead of being able to smoothly continue on the next pattern with the same parameters. The last thing is how the ARP is saved. On the Digitone, the ARP is saved per sound, while the Analog 4 saves the ARP with the kit or with the pattern, and not the sounds themselves. This means that for drums, for example, let's say this kit, Right now I'm using a kick sound, a hi-hat which is which has ARP enabled, and a snare. So the kick sound and the snare sound, they don't have ARP enabled, but the hi-hats have ARP enabled. So let's just save this and I'll remove the kicks and snares. There are only 4 trigs, but there are 8 hi-hats, and that's because I have ARP enabled on the hi-hats. But on the Analog 4, let's play the drums only. If I enable ARP, it enables ARP on all the sounds, and you can't p-lock them, and you can't p-lock anything on the ARP menu. Yeah, except notes. You can p-lock notes. So there's no way to have some sounds be ARP enabled, like on the Digitone, while other sounds not being ARP enabled. So every sound has ARP, or no sound has ARP on the Analog 4. On the Digitone, you can actually save an ARP version of the sound, of any sound, to the sound pool, and save, you can have different speeds and then save those sounds to the sound pool, and then you can sound lock the ARP enabled version or the normal not ARP enabled version per trig, so it's really flexible. And yeah, that's all the notes I've taken so far.